Inside a building on 3rd Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, there is a floor that almost no one was permitted to enter. Not Madoff's own clients, not the SEC, not even most of his staff. For 17 years, that floor was where the money went and where it stopped existing. December 10th, 2008. Bernie Madoff calls his 2 sons into his Manhattan apartment. He tells them the investment advisory business is over, that the money is gone, all $65 billion of it. His sons call the FBI the following morning. When agents arrive at his penthouse at 8:30 a.m., they ask Madoff if there is an innocent explanation for what they have found. He says, "No, there is no innocent explanation." 17 years, $65 billion, one open door. To understand what Bernie Madoff built, you first have to understand what the world believed he was. Bernard Lawrence Madoff was born in Queens, New York in 1938. He started his investment firm, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, known as BLMIS, in 1960, with $5,000 he had saved lifeguarding on beaches and installing sprinkler systems. That firm became one of the most respected on Wall Street. By the 1980s, Madoff's trading operation was processing more volume than any firm on the New York Stock Exchange. His technology helped lay the infrastructure for what would become NASDAQ. He served as its chairman 3 times. Regulators trusted him. Hedge funds trusted him. When the SEC needed insight into how modern markets worked, they consulted Madoff. But alongside the legitimate trading desk, there was a quieter operation. A private investment fund, by invitation only. Access to Madoff's fund was considered a social currency among the wealthy on the Upper East Side and in Palm Beach. You didn't negotiate terms. You considered yourself fortunate to be accepted. He promised consistent annual returns of 10 to 12%, regardless of market conditions. In good years, in bad years, through the dot-com crash, through 9/11s, the number barely moved. No one stopped to ask why. The first person to say something publicly was a financial analyst in Boston named Harry Markopolos. In 1999, Markopolos was asked by his employer to reverse engineer Madoff's strategy, to figure out exactly how he was producing returns so they could replicate them. He spent 4 hours with a spreadsheet. He concluded it was mathematically impossible. Madoff claimed to be running a strategy called split-strike conversion, buying a basket of S&P 100 stocks, then hedging positions with options, a legitimate strategy, widely used. But the returns he was posting could not be produced by that strategy, not at that scale, not with that consistency. The options market he claimed to be using was not large enough to execute his stated positions even once, let alone continuously over decades. Markopolos submitted a detailed complaint to the SEC in May 2000, 8 years before the collapse, with 29 specific red flags. The SEC investigated briefly and closed the inquiry. He submitted again in 2001 and 2005 and 2007, each time with more evidence, more specific analysis, more urgency. The SEC never charged Madoff. In 2001, a Barron's journalist named Erin Arvedlund published a pointed article asking why a strategy available to anyone was somehow delivering returns that only Madoff could achieve. Her editors ran it. Investors who read it largely ignored it. The crack had been visible since the turn of the century. For 17 years, nobody widened it far enough to matter. But the most audacious part of the fraud wasn't the fake returns. It was what Madoff built on a floor that almost no one in his own company knew existed. We'll get there. What ultimately brought the scheme down was not a regulator, a journalist, or a whistleblower. It was a liquidity crisis. The same force that was simultaneously cracking open banks, hedge funds, and governments across the world. The 2008 financial collapse terrified Madoff's investors. They did what panicked investors always do. They asked for their money back. In November and December of 2008 alone, redemption requests totaling approximately $7 billion hit BLMIS. There was nothing to pay them with. There never had been. Madoff had been operating what the law calls a Ponzi scheme. New investor money was used to pay the returns promised to existing investors. There was no portfolio, no trades, no strategy, just a rotating cast of depositors funding withdrawals for those who came before them. By December 2008, the circle had run out of new money faster than old money was going out. On the evening of December 9th, 2008, Madoff summoned his sons, Mark and Andrew, who worked at the legitimate trading side of the business and had no involvement in the advisory fund. He told them the business was, in his own words, one big lie. He told them the losses were approximately $50 billion. The actual figure, as determined later by the court-appointed trustee, was $65 billion. Mark and Andrew did not call the police immediately. They consulted an attorney that night. The following morning, December 10th, they contacted the FBI. Federal agents arrived at Madoff's penthouse apartment at 8:30 a.m. He answered the door himself. He was arrested on the spot. Within hours, BLMIS was placed into the hands of a court-appointed trustee. The firm's offices were sealed, and investigators made their way to a floor of the Lipstick Building that almost no one had ever been permitted to enter. The 17th floor. The mechanics of the fraud were almost elegant in their simplicity. Madoff's legitimate trading operation ran from the 19th floor of the Lipstick Building, a real brokerage with real trades, real technology, real compliance staff, and a genuine reputation. That floor is what the world saw. The 17th floor was different. A small, isolated operation staffed by a handful of hand-picked employees who reported directly to Madoff. Separate computer systems, separate phone lines, no connection to the trading operation above. There were no trades executed on that floor. Ever. Instead, employees manufactured paper statements. They would look up historical stock prices from newspapers and financial databases, construct a plausible-looking portfolio, the right stocks, the right entry points, options hedges attached, and print account statements showing the returns clients expected. The statements were indistinguishable from legitimate broker confirmations. They arrived on BLMIS letterhead with account numbers, transaction histories, and year-end tax documents. Because the legitimate trading operation was a registered broker-dealer with its own back-office infrastructure, the paperwork passed every surface-level inspection. The feeder fund structure amplified the concealment. Madoff did not advertise. He worked through intermediaries, feeder funds, that raised money from investors, charged their own management fees, and directed client capital to BLMIS. Fairfield Greenwich Group alone funneled $14 billion into Madoff's fund. These firms had every financial incentive to believe. They collected fees, they handed over capital, and they never verified a single trade. The scheme worked for 17 years because it exploited three things. Exclusivity as a trust mechanism. If you had to be invited in, it must be safe. Complexity as camouflage. The strategy sounded real enough that few clients had the technical background to challenge it. And a regulator that, when it finally looked at the records, accepted documents that were never cross-checked against actual market data. Madoff didn't hide the money in a labyrinth. He hid it on the floor below. Bernard Madoff pleaded guilty on March 12, 2009, to 11 federal felony counts: securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, making false statements, and perjury. He received a sentence of 150 years in federal prison, the maximum available. The firm's trustee, Irving Picard, spent the following decade attempting to claw back losses through litigation and asset seizures. By 2023, he had recovered approximately $14.7 billion, roughly 93 cents on the dollar for those who qualified for recovery under SIPC protections. But recovery was not equal. The scheme created two classes of victim: those who had withdrawn more than they deposited over time, net winners who were later sued by the trustee to return fictitious profits, and those who lost everything they had ever put in. A retired couple in Florida, he was a physician, she a school teacher, had moved their entire retirement savings to Madoff in 2001 on the recommendation of their accountant. They lost $2.3 million. He was 71, she was 68. They were not the kind of people who appear in Senate hearings. They were the kind of people this floor was designed to fool. Madoff's son Mark took his own life on December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years to the day after his father's arrest. Andrew Madoff died of cancer in 2014. Bernie Madoff died in federal prison on April 14, 2021, aged 82. The Madoff case is taught in business schools as a regulatory failure. That reading is accurate. but it is incomplete. The SEC received detailed, mathematically rigorous warnings for 9 consecutive years. They didn't act because the person being accused was Bernie Madoff, a former NASDAQ chairman, a celebrated industry statesman. No examiner inside the SEC wanted to be the person who was wrong about Bernie Madoff. This failure has a name: authority bias. The more credentialed and celebrated the institution, the harder it becomes for any individual inside the system to challenge it. Madoff wore his reputation like armor. The feeder funds failed for a different reason. They collected fees for due diligence they did not perform. Every dollar Fairfield Greenwich sent to Madoff was a dollar they had incentive not to scrutinize. And Madoff's clients, the sophisticated ones, the experienced ones, the lawyers, the bankers, the philanthropists, failed because exclusivity felt like safety. If this were fraud, why would they let me in? That question, why would they let me in, is one of the most effective levers a fraudster can pull, because it makes the victim a co-conspirator in their own deception. The 17th floor was never hidden. It was simply never looked at. That is not a story about a criminal genius. It is a story about a system that looked everywhere except at the evidence. And that story does not end with Bernie Madoff.